Can one of you guys explain the Oslo Agreement and how that was kind of close? What went wrong with that?
I honestly don't look into it a lot.
Nah, you know what, Jimmy? I gave up a long time ago.
3. Jim Norton and the Oslo Accords. The Deadly Price of Pursuing Peace. By Evelyn Gordon, Commentary Magazine, January 2010. When the Oslo process began in 1993, one benefit its adherents promised was a significant improvement in Israel's international standing. And initially, it seemed as if that promise would be kept. 37 countries soon established or renewed diplomatic relations with Israel. A peace treaty was signed with Jordan. 5 other Arab states opened lower-level relations. But 16 years later, it is clear that initial boost was illusory. Not only is Israel's standing no better than it was prior to the famous handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn in September 1993, it has fallen to an unprecedented low. Efforts to boycott and divest from Israel are gaining strength throughout the West, among groups as diverse as British academics, Canadian labor unions, and Norwegian government investment fund, and American churches. Israeli military operations routinely spark huge protests worldwide, often featuring anti-Semitic slogans. References to Israel as an apartheid state have become so commonplace that even the former president of Israel's closest ally, the United States, had no qualms about using the term on the title of his 2007 book on Israel. European polls repeatedly deem Israel the greatest threat to world peace, greater even than such beacons of tranquility and democracy as Iran and North Korea. Courts in several European countries, including Belgium, Britain, and Spain, have seriously considered indicting Israeli officials for war crimes, though none have actually done so. And in October, when the United Nations Human Rights Council overwhelmingly endorsed a report that advocated holding Israel before the International Criminal Court on war crimes charges, even many of Jerusalem's supposed allies refused to vote against the measure. In academic and media circles, it has even become acceptable to question Israel's very right to exist, something never asked about any other state in the world. None of these developments was imaginable back in the days when Israel refused to talk to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, otherwise known as the PLO, had yet to withdraw from an inch of Palestinian land, and had not evacuated a single settlement. Yet even today, conventional wisdom, including in Israel, continues to assert that Israel's international standing depends on its willingness to advance the peace process. That invites an obvious question. If so, why has Israel's reputation fallen so low despite its numerous concessions for peace since 1993? The answer is unpleasant to contemplate, but the mounting evidence makes it inescapable. Israel's standing has declined so precipitously not despite Oslo, but because of Oslo. It was Israel's very willingness to make concessions for the sake of peace that has produced its current near-pariah status. Why should this be so? There are several reasons. First, Oslo led Israel to sideline its own claim to the West Bank and Gaza, which all Israeli governments and international Jewish leaders had stressed to some extent before 1993. Though there had long been a lively debate as to whether Israel ought to hold on to these territories in practice, until 1993 all sides were ready to assert that it had a valid claim to them in principle. The argument in favor of Israel's right to sovereignty there was simple. These territories are historic Jewish homeland, the heart of the biblical Jewish kingdom. They were explicitly allotted to the future Jewish state by the 1922 League of Nations mandate, which was never legally superseded. Although the 1947 UN partition plan allotted part of the land to a putative Arab state, a plan the Palestinians and other Arabs rejected as a matter of principle, was merely a non-binding recommendation, as its own language stated. Thus, once the Arabs rejected it, the measure had no more validity than any other unsigned deal, nor did any sovereign state ever replace the mandate on this territory. Though Jordan and Egypt conquered the West Bank and Gaza respectively in 1948, neither conquest was ever internationally recognized. Legally, therefore, the territories remain stateless, at the very least lands whose ownership is disputed. Over time, the Palestinians simply replaced Egypt and Jordan as the Arab claimants. None of this precludes an Israeli secession of these areas. Countries often waive territorial claims to secure peace agreements, but only if Israel has a valid claim can the act of ceding these lands be a painful concession that could arouse sympathy and admiration from the world. If Israel has no claim, it is nothing but a thief, and no one would admire a thief for returning some, but not all, of his stolen property, or for offering to return some, but still not all, of the rest if granted sufficient compensation. Such behavior would be universally condemned. Indeed, if Israel has no claim to the land, even conditioning withdrawal on an end to Palestinian terror becomes harder to justify. If the land is Israel, Israel can obviously refuse to cede it, unless it receives peace in exchange. But if the land belongs to the Palestinians, many might argue that it should be returned unconditionally. Thank you, Oslo. This later notion, however, is precisely the picture Israeli discourse has increasingly painted since 1993. Perhaps because pro-Oslo Israelis viewed Israel's own rights as too self-evident to need restating, they inevitably focused on defending the Oslo Accords' new and domestically controversial claim that Palestinians too have a legitimate and political rights in the West Bank and Gaza. Thus, for instance, Labour Party chairman and later Prime Minister Ehud Barak said in a 1998 television interview that had he been a Palestinian, he would have joined a terrorist organization because there is legitimacy for a Palestinian to fight. Such claims were rarely heard from mainstream Israelis prior to 1993. While the moderate left had always favored ceding territory, it historically framed this as a necessity of peacemaking rather than a matter of Arab rights. Moreover, as repeated Israeli concessions brought only more Palestinian terror, making them harder to justify in the name of peace, even right-of-center Israeli leaders increasingly justified them in the language of Palestinian rights. Then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, for instance, stunned the Knesset in 2003 by declaring, I think the idea that it is possible to continue keeping 3.5 million Palestinians under occupation. Yes, it is occupation. You may not like the word, but what is happening is occupation. It's bad for Israel and bad for the Palestinians. But if Palestinians have legitimate rights to this land, it must belong to them. And if Israel is occupying the land, it must not belong to Israel. That, in plain English, is what rights and occupation mean. The problem was exacerbated by Sharon's unilateral disengagement from Gaza in 2005 and a Ehud election the following year on a platform of unilaterally quitting most of the West Bank. Until then, Israel had deemed evicting settlers from their homes a personal and national tragedy that merited sympathy and compensation. But then two successive Israeli prime ministers declared that for both demographic and security reasons, uprooting settlements was an Israeli interest. A plurality of Israelis even endorsed this view in a national election, and if so, dismantling settlements cannot be a painful concession for which Israel deserves to be rewarded. Granted, much of the world has disposed to accept the Palestinian claim even before Oslo, but as the sage Hillel famously said 2,000 years ago, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Oslo marked the moment when Israel stopped defending its own claim to the West Bank and Gaza and instead increasingly endorsed the Palestinian claim. And with no competing narrative to challenge it any longer, the view of Israel as a thief, with all its attendant consequences, has gained unprecedented traction. Thank you, Oslo.